The little girl's face turned red as she gasped for air, clutching her throat. Her mother screamed for water, but the flight attendant folded her arms and said the words that would change everything, "I don't serve your kind." What this woman didn't know was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career, because that mother wasn't just any passenger. She was about to ground the entire airline. But before we get to that moment of reckoning, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. Let me introduce you to 8-year-old Maya Thompson, a little girl whose only crime was being excited about her first flight in first class. Maya was the kind of child who made everyone around her smile. With her natural hair styled in 2 perfect puffs that bounced when she walked, and wearing her favorite purple dress that she'd picked out herself for this special trip, she radiated pure joy. Clutched tightly in her small hands was Peanut, a worn stuffed elephant that had been her companion since she was 3 years old. Peanut went everywhere Maya went, to school, to the park, to bed every single night. And today Peanut was going on an airplane. This wasn't just any trip. Maya was flying first class for the very first time, traveling from New York to Atlanta to visit her grandmother, and she could barely contain her excitement. From the moment they arrived at the airport, questions poured out of her like water from a fountain. "Mommy, how do planes stay in the sky? Are we going to fly through the clouds? Will I be able to touch them? How fast do we go? Can birds fly as high as airplanes?" Every new sight sparked another wave of wonder. The massive windows overlooking the runway. The business travelers rushing past with their rolling suitcases. The announcement boards displaying destinations from around the world. Her mother answered each question with patience and love, never once showing annoyance at the constant stream of curiosity. Because that was just who Maya was, bright, inquisitive, innocent in the most beautiful way. She saw the world as full of possibilities and adventures waiting to happen. But Maya's mother knew something her daughter didn't. Maya had mild peanut allergies. Nothing severe, nothing that had ever caused serious problems before, but enough that Gabrielle Thompson was always careful, always prepared. She carried an EpiPen in her purse at all times, along with Benadryl just in case. She checked every label, asked about ingredients at restaurants, and made sure teachers and babysitters knew about the allergy. It was manageable, controlled, one of those things that required awareness but not fear. The bond between Maya and her mother was the kind that could be felt by anyone who saw them together. Gabrielle had a way of making her daughter feel like the most important person in any room. When Maya spoke, Gabrielle listened with her full attention. When Maya worried, Gabrielle soothed her fears with words that felt like a warm blanket. When Maya laughed, Gabrielle's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. This was more than mother and daughter. This was a partnership built on unconditional love, trust, and protection. Maya knew deep in her bones that as long as her mother was near, she was safe. Nothing bad could happen. Mommy would always protect her. If you're already invested in Maya's story, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Now let me tell you about Maya's mother, because understanding Gabrielle Thompson is essential to understanding why what happened on that flight was the worst mistake Christine Morrison would ever make. Gabrielle Thompson, at 38 years old, was a woman who had earned every ounce of respect she commanded, though you'd never know her status by looking at her. She didn't dress to impress or flaunt her wealth. Her natural hair was pulled back in an elegant low bun, her makeup minimal and understated. She wore a tailored cream blazer that spoke of quality rather than flash, and designer sunglasses that she'd bought because they were well-made, not because of the label. There were no massive diamond rings, no statement necklaces, no luxury handbags covered in logos. Gabrielle Thompson had nothing to prove to anyone, but the way she carried herself told a different story. There was a quiet confidence in her posture, an ease in her movements that came from someone who had fought every battle life threw at her and emerged victorious. She walked through the world knowing her worth, not because someone told her, but because she had built it with her own 2 hands. Gabrielle's journey hadn't been easy. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, the daughter of a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night to keep food on the table. While other kids her age were sleeping, young Gabrielle would sometimes accompany her mother to those empty offices, doing homework under fluorescent lights while her mother scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans. She learned early that nothing in life was handed to you. You worked for it. You earned it. You fought for it. She discovered computers in high school and something clicked. The logic of code, the problem solving, the way you could build something from nothing but ideas and determination. It spoke to her soul. She taught herself programming, spending hours at the public library because they couldn't afford a computer at home. She earned scholarships, worked 3 jobs through college, graduated top of her class in computer science from MIT, and landed a job at a major tech company. But Gabrielle didn't want to work for someone else's dream. She wanted to build her own. So at 26, with $15,000 in savings and a vision that most people called crazy, she started Thompson Aerospace Technologies from her studio apartment. She wrote code for 18 hours a day, lived on ramen noodles and black coffee, pitched her ideas to investors who looked at her like she was delusional. A young black woman with no connections trying to break into defense contracting, one of the most exclusive and difficult industries in America. They told her no. Over and over and over again they told her no. But Gabrielle had learned something from watching her mother scrub floors. You don't stop when people say no. You stop when you succeed. 12 years later, Thompson Aerospace Technologies was a billion-dollar defense contractor providing cutting-edge technology to the Department of Defense. Gabrielle employed over 3,000 people, held patents on innovations that were changing military aviation, and had her name on contracts that made grown men in boardrooms nervous. She'd been featured in Forbes, Fortune, and Time magazine. She'd been invited to the White House twice. She sat on boards of major corporations and had venture capitalists begging her to let them invest in her next project. But none of that defined her. What defined Gabrielle Thompson was her integrity, her work ethic, and her absolute refusal to tolerate disrespect, especially when it came to her daughter. As they sat in the first-class lounge that morning, waiting to board, Gabrielle was checking her phone, scrolling through messages from board members about quarterly earnings, a reminder about a Department of Defense contract meeting scheduled for the following week that could mean another $200 million in revenue. But even as she handled business that most people couldn't fathom, her attention was always partially on Maya, making sure her daughter was comfortable, happy, safe. Gabrielle's philosophy was simple. She'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and overcome too many obstacles to waste energy on small-minded people. She didn't engage with pettiness, didn't feel the need to put anyone in their place, didn't care if people underestimated her because of how she looked. She knew who she was. Her bank account knew who she was. Her employees knew who she was. That was enough. But there was one line Gabrielle would never let anyone cross. You don't disrespect her daughter. You don't make Maya feel less than, unwelcome, or unsafe. Cross that line, and you discover that Gabrielle's quiet confidence concealed something far more powerful. A mother's fierce, unrelenting love and a billionaire's ability to make problems disappear or, when necessary, to make sure those problems never happened again. Now, let me introduce you to the woman who was about to cross that line and pay a price she couldn't imagine. Christine Morrison had been a flight attendant for 18 years, and she wore her seniority like a badge of honor. At 47, with her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face, and makeup applied with such a heavy hand it looked like armor, Christine had long ago lost whatever warmth she might have once possessed. The permanent scowl lines around her mouth told the story of years spent judging, criticizing, and looking down on people she deemed unworthy. Christine prided herself on maintaining standards in first class. That's how she phrased it to herself, to other flight attendants, to anyone who'd listen. Standards. As if treating people with basic human decency was somehow lowering the bar. In Christine's mind, first class wasn't just about bigger seats and better food, it was about exclusivity, about separating the worthy from the unworthy, about maintaining an order she believed was natural and right. The truth was darker and simpler. Christine Morrison was a bigot, though she'd never used that word to describe herself. She thought of herself as traditional, as someone who understood how things should be. But her tradition was built on prejudice, her understanding rooted in racism she'd never examined or questioned. Over the past few years, Christine had grown increasingly bitter. Younger flight attendants, many of them people of color, were being promoted ahead of her. The airline had implemented diversity initiatives, unconscious bias training, new policies about inclusive service. Christine resented all of it. In her mind, these changes weren't about fairness or progress. They were about political correctness gone mad, about giving advantages to people who hadn't earned them the way she had. She believed first class should be reserved for certain people. And though she'd never say it out loud in quite those words, she meant wealthy white passengers. People who looked like they belonged there. People who fit her narrow, poisonous definition of success and worth. So when Christine Morrison walked through first class that morning, checking that everything was perfect before passengers boarded, and then stood at the aircraft door greeting travelers with her fake smile, something shifted in her expression when she saw Gabrielle and Maya Thompson walking down the jetway toward her. A black woman and a black child. Heading toward first class. Christine's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Her smile tightened. As they approached, she scanned them from head to toe, her mind already racing with assumptions, prejudices, doubts. They couldn't possibly have paid full price for those seats, she thought. Probably used miles. Or some kind of program. Or maybe there was a booking error. It happened sometimes. People ended up in the wrong cabin, and she'd have to politely but firmly redirect them to their actual seats in economy. Gabrielle and Maya reached seats 2A and 2B, right in the front of the first-class cabin, the most premium seats on the aircraft. Christine watched as Gabrielle helped Maya get settled, lifting her into the wide leather seat, making sure Peanut the elephant was secure, pulling out a coloring book from her bag to keep Maya entertained. The professional part of Christine's brain knew she was supposed to greet them, offer them beverages, make them feel welcome. But the poisonous part of her brain, the part that had been growing stronger with each passing year of resentment and bitterness, resisted. She stood in the galley, arms crossed, watching them with barely concealed suspicion. They don't belong here, she thought. First class is for people who've earned it, people who've worked hard, people who deserve luxury. She looked at 8-year-old Maya, innocent and excited, and felt nothing but judgment. She looked at Gabrielle, accomplished and elegant, and saw only what her prejudice allowed her to see, someone who didn't fit her narrow definition of who belonged in first class. Christine Morrison had no idea who Gabrielle Thompson was. She had no idea about the empire Gabrielle had built, the obstacles she'd overcome, the respect she commanded in boardrooms across America. She had no idea that the woman in seat 2A could buy the entire airline if she wanted to. But more importantly, Christine Morrison had no idea that in a few short hours, her prejudice, her cruelty, and her refusal to see the humanity in a choking child would cost her everything. Her job, her reputation, and quite possibly her freedom. Because when you deny water to a gasping 8-year-old girl and tell her mother, "I don't serve your kind," you'd better hope that mother doesn't have the power to ground your entire airline and make sure you never forget the consequences of your hatred. What would you do if you witnessed a flight attendant refuse to help a choking child? Drop your answer in the comments below, because this story is just getting started, and trust me, you won't believe what happens when Maya's allergic reaction begins and Christine Morrison makes the choice that will haunt her for the rest of her life. The boarding process continued, and if you were watching carefully, you'd notice something disturbing beginning to unfold. Something subtle at first, the kind of discrimination that people who've never experienced it might miss entirely, but that Gabrielle Thompson recognized immediately because she'd been dealing with it her entire life. Christine Morrison stood at the entrance of the first-class cabin, greeting passengers as they boarded. And her performance was remarkable, not in a good way but in how transparently different her treatment was depending on who was walking through that door. When a white businessman in his 50s approached, Christine's face transformed into pure sunshine. "Welcome aboard, sir. So wonderful to have you in first class today. Can I take your jacket? Would you like me to hang that up for you? We'll be taking off shortly, and I'll be around with beverages as soon as we're in the air. It's going to be a fantastic flight." Her voice was warm, enthusiastic, the kind of service that makes people feel valued and special. When a white couple in their 60s boarded next, the same performance. "Good morning. Welcome, welcome. Oh, what a lovely scarf. First class is going to be so comfortable for you today. Let me help you with that bag. Perfect. We're so happy to have you flying with us." Passenger after passenger received this treatment. The warmth, the enthusiasm, the genuine seeming interest in making their flight experience exceptional. Christine Morrison knew how to play the part of the perfect flight attendant when she wanted to. But then she reached row 2 where Gabrielle was still getting Maya settled and everything changed. Christine's smile didn't just fade, it evaporated like water on hot pavement. Her warm, welcoming voice was replaced by something cold and bureaucratic. She stopped in the aisle and instead of a greeting, instead of a welcome, she simply said 2 words, "Boarding passes." Not "good morning." Not "welcome aboard." Not "let me help you get settled." Just "boarding passes," delivered in a tone that was clipped, suspicious, and bordered on accusatory. Gabrielle looked up from buckling Maya into her seat. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Recognition, weariness, anger, but she smoothed it away instantly. She'd dealt with this 1,000 times before. She knew exactly what was happening. And she'd learned long ago that the best response to microaggressions was to remain calm, dignified, and unbothered, even when rage was building inside her chest. She reached into her elegant leather bag and pulled out both boarding passes, handing them to Christine without a word. No confrontation. No attitude. Just smooth compliance, because Gabrielle Thompson didn't need to prove anything to this woman. Christine took the boarding passes and examined them like a detective searching for evidence at a crime scene. She looked at the names. Checked the seat numbers. Compared them to the physical seats. looked at the names again. Her eyes moved back and forth between the passes and Gabrielle's face, as if trying to find some discrepancy, some error, some reason these two black passengers couldn't possibly belong in these premium seats. The scrutiny lasted far longer than necessary. Every other passenger had handed over their boarding pass and received it back within seconds. But Christine stood there, studying Gabrielle's and Maya's passes like they were written in a foreign language she was struggling to translate. Gabrielle watched her with calm eyes, her expression neutral but her mind fully aware of what this woman was doing. She was hoping to find a mistake. Hoping the seats were wrong, the booking was in error, something that would allow her to redirect them elsewhere. Christine Morrison wanted any excuse to move these passengers out of her first-class cabin. But the boarding passes were perfect. Seats 2A and 2B. First class. Properly booked, properly paid for, everything exactly as it should be. Christine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Without a word, no thank you, no enjoy your flight, nothing, she handed the passes back to Gabrielle and moved on to the next row, where her warm smile magically reappeared for the white passengers sitting there. Maya, oblivious to the tension, was already enchanted by the size of her seat. Mommy, look how big it is. And it has a TV. Can I watch cartoons? Her little legs swung back and forth, not quite reaching the floor, Peanut the elephant secure in her lap. Gabrielle helped her daughter explore the seat's features, showing her how the entertainment system worked, making sure she was comfortable. But even as she focused on Maya, Gabrielle's mind was processing what had just happened. The cold greeting. The excessive scrutiny. The lack of basic courtesy. She'd seen this pattern before, experienced it countless times, and every single time it stung, not for herself but for what it represented. That's when another flight attendant appeared. Her name tag read Rosa, and she looked to be in her late 20s with kind eyes and a genuine smile. Rosa had been watching the interaction from the galley and unlike Christine, she saw Gabrielle and Maya for what they were, passengers who deserved kindness. Hi there. Rosa said, crouching down to Maya's eye level. What's your name, sweetheart? Maya lit up. I'm Maya. And this is Peanut. She held up her stuffed elephant proudly. It's so nice to meet you, Maya. And Peanut. Is this your first time in first class? Maya nodded enthusiastically. Yes. We're going to see my grandma in Atlanta. Rosa reached into her apron and pulled out a coloring book and a small pack of crayons. Well, we're so happy to have you. I thought you might like these for the flight. There are all kinds of animals to color. Maya's eyes went wide with delight. Thank you. Rosa stood and made eye contact with Gabrielle, and in that brief moment something passed between them. An acknowledgement, an apology, a recognition of what had just transpired. Rosa had seen Christine's behavior. She knew it was wrong. And while she couldn't directly confront her senior colleague, she could offer this small gesture of humanity to counter the coldness. Gabrielle nodded her thanks and Rosa moved on to attend to other passengers. Maya immediately opened the coloring book, selected a green crayon, and began coloring an elephant, chattering happily to Peanut about which colors to use next. Gabrielle watched her daughter's joy and felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from loving someone so much and knowing the world wouldn't always treat them fairly. Maya was 8 years old, innocent, bright, full of wonder about flying through clouds and visiting her grandmother. She didn't understand why that flight attendant had been cold. She didn't recognize the racism for what it was. And part of Gabrielle was grateful for that innocence, even as she knew she'd eventually have to help her daughter understand the uglier realities of the world they lived in. Gabrielle pulled out her phone and began texting her assistant about the contract negotiations scheduled for next week. She had a business to run, deals to close, decisions to make. She wouldn't let Christine Morrison's prejudice disrupt her focus. She'd risen above far worse than a bitter flight attendant with a bad attitude. But even as her fingers moved across the screen, even as she reviewed projections and approved meeting agendas, part of her mind stayed alert, watchful, protective. Because Gabrielle Thompson had learned something crucial over the years. When people show you who they are through small acts of disrespect, you should believe them. Christine Morrison had shown her colors during boarding, and Gabrielle suspected this wouldn't be the last unpleasant interaction of the flight. She had no idea how right she was. She had no idea that Christine's prejudice was about to escalate in ways that would put Maya's life in danger. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, the safety demonstration played on the screens, and the plane taxied toward the runway. Maya pressed her face against the window, watching everything with fascination. The other planes. The ground crew. The lights along the taxiway. Mommy, we're moving, she whispered excitedly as if it were a secret they were sharing. The The plane lifted off, and Maya gasped with pure joy as the ground fell away beneath them. Within minutes they were above the clouds and Maya's questions started flowing again. Are we really flying? How does the plane stay up? Where's Atlanta from here? Gabrielle answered each one patiently, her love for her daughter's curiosity overriding everything else. About 20 minutes into the flight, once they reached cruising altitude, Christine's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The captain has turned off the seatbelt sign, and you're now free to move about the cabin. Our first-class service will begin shortly. In the galley, Christine began preparing the beverage cart. First-class service on this route included champagne, premium wines, cocktails, and gourmet snacks, warm mixed nuts, premium crackers, artisanal cheese. It was part of what passengers paid extra for, that elevated experience, that sense of luxury. Christine wheeled the cart down the aisle, starting from the front. Her performance was, once again, remarkable in its contrast. Good morning, sir. May I offer you some champagne? We have a lovely view of Cliquot today. Or perhaps a cocktail. Wonderful. And here are some warm nuts. Careful, they're hot. Enjoy. Ma'am, what can I get for you to drink? Oh, white wine, excellent choice. I'll pour you a generous glass. And here you go, some snacks to go with that. You're very welcome. Passenger after passenger received this treatment. Christine was attentive, generous with portions, enthusiastic about making sure everyone had exactly what they wanted. And then she reached row 2. She stopped the cart directly next to Gabrielle and Maya's seats. Gabrielle looked up from her tablet, where she'd been reviewing quarterly projections. Maya was still coloring, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration as she carefully stayed inside the lines. But Christine didn't offer them anything. Didn't ask about beverages. Didn't present the snacks. She simply stood there for a moment, then began to move past them. Gabrielle's voice was calm and polite. Excuse me, may I have some water, please? Christine stopped but didn't turn around fully. Her tone, when she responded, was dismissive and cold. I'll get to you when I have time. Just like that. No apology. No, I'll be right back. No acknowledgement of the fact that she just served every other passenger in first class except for them. Just, I'll get to you when I have time, as if Gabrielle and Maya were an inconvenience, a burden, not worth the same level of service as everyone else in the cabin. Christine continued down the aisle, moving to the next row, where her warm smile and enthusiastic service returned instantly. Hello there. What can I get for you folks today? Champagne? Absolutely. And for you, sir? Tomato juice coming right up. Maya, who had been focused on her coloring, looked up. She'd noticed that the other passengers had received snacks in small bowls, golden nuts that looked crunchy and delicious. She'd heard the flight attendant offering drinks, using that happy voice. But the flight attendant had walked right past them. Mommy, Maya said, her voice small and confused, why didn't the lady give us snacks? Gabrielle's jaw tightened. She felt anger rising in her throat like bile, hot and bitter. But when she looked at her daughter's innocent, confused face, she forced herself to breathe, to stay calm, to not let Maya see the rage that was building inside her. It's okay, baby, Gabrielle said, keeping her voice gentle. Sometimes people forget their manners. Don't worry about it. You have your crackers in our bag if you get hungry. But Maya's question had been loud enough that the passenger across the aisle heard it. His name was Robert Patterson, a 72-year-old retired physician with white hair and kind eyes, traveling to Atlanta to visit his daughter and grandchildren. He'd been watching the interactions throughout the flight with growing concern, and Maya's innocent question crystallized something he'd been trying to ignore. He looked at Gabrielle and Maya, then at the back of Christine's head as she continued serving other passengers. His frown deepened. He'd lived long enough to recognize discrimination when he saw it, and what he was witnessing made him ashamed to be sitting in a cabin where such treatment was happening. That's when Rosa reappeared, moving quickly and quietly. She carried 2 bottles of water and placed them on Gabrielle and Maya's tray tables without saying a word. But her eyes met Gabrielle's, and in that look was an apology, a recognition, a silent message that said, I see this, I know this is wrong, and I'm sorry. Gabrielle nodded slightly, accepting the gesture for what it was. One human being showing kindness to another in a situation where kindness had been deliberately withheld. But Christine saw the interaction. Her head snapped around, her eyes narrowing as she watched Rosa delivering water to the passengers she deliberately ignored. Rosa felt Christine's glare on her back but didn't acknowledge it, simply returned to her duties as if nothing unusual had happened. Christine's expression darkened. Her authority was being undermined. Her deliberate slight was being corrected. And that made her angrier than the mere presence of Gabrielle and Maya in first class. Gabrielle opened her tablet again, pulling up documents related to the Department of Defense contract she'd be discussing next week. Numbers, specifications, delivery timelines, work that normally captured her full attention. But today, her mind kept drifting from the screen to her daughter, to the coldness they were experiencing, to the casual cruelty of being treated as less than human simply because of the color of their skin. Gabrielle had dealt with racism her entire life. She'd experienced it in college, where professors assumed she was only admitted because of affirmative action. She'd experienced it in corporate America, where colleagues questioned her qualifications and clients were surprised when she walked into negotiations. She'd experienced it in business dealings, where venture capitalists looked at her with skepticism and barely concealed doubt. She'd experienced it shopping in expensive stores, where security followed her, assuming she couldn't afford to be there. She'd experienced it trying to hail cabs, buying her house, opening bank accounts, walking down streets in certain neighborhoods. She'd developed armor against it, a way of moving through the world that didn't let the prejudice touch her core. She knew her worth. She knew her capabilities. She knew that people's racism said everything about them and nothing about her. But watching it directed at Maya was different. Maya was innocent, pure, untouched by the ugliness of the world. And every time someone treated her daughter as less than, every time someone let their prejudice show in how they spoke to or looked at Maya, Gabrielle felt something primal and fierce awaken inside her. That protective instinct that every mother has, magnified by the knowledge that her daughter would face obstacles and judgments that had nothing to do with her character, her intelligence, her kindness, or her worth. Gabrielle looked at Maya, who had returned to her coloring, humming softly to herself. Peanut sat propped against the window watching the clouds go by. Her daughter was happy, oblivious to the deeper meaning of what was happening around her. And Gabrielle made a decision in that moment. She would let this go. She would maintain her composure. She would get Maya to Atlanta safely, and they would have a wonderful visit with Grandma, and this flight would become nothing more than an unpleasant memory. She would not cause a scene. She would not give Christine Morrison the satisfaction of seeing her upset. She would simply endure this final hour of flight time and then move on with her life, because Gabrielle Thompson had far more important things to focus on than one bitter racist flight attendant. But fate had other plans. Because in Maya's backpack, nestled among her coloring books and her spare clothes and her other snacks, was a granola bar. And in about 15 minutes, that granola bar was going to turn this uncomfortable flight into a nightmare that would change everything. Maya finished coloring her elephant, green body, pink ears, blue trunk, because 8-year-olds don't worry about whether elephants come in those colors. She held up her picture proudly. "Mommy, look, I made Peanut's cousin." Gabrielle smiled, genuinely delighted by her daughter's creativity. "That's beautiful, baby. Peanut must be so happy to have such a colorful cousin." Maya carefully tore the page out of the coloring book and set it aside. "I'm going to give this to Grandma when we get there. She's going to love it." "Mommy, I'm a little bit hungry. Can I have a snack?" Gabrielle reached for her bag, the large leather tote where she kept everything they might need for the flight. Snacks, activities, medications, entertainment. She rummaged through it, looking for the package of safe snacks she'd packed specifically for Maya. The crackers she knew were peanut-free, the fruit pouches, the cheese sticks. But Maya had already unzipped her own small backpack and pulled out a granola bar. "I have this one," she announced happily. Gabrielle glanced over and nodded absently, her attention still on her tablet, where a message from her chief financial officer had just appeared about a supply chain issue that needed her input. "Okay, baby. Go ahead." Maya tore open the wrapper with the determination of a hungry 8-year-old. The granola bar looked delicious, oats and honey and what looked like chocolate chips. She took a big bite, chewing happily. Within seconds something changed. Maya stopped chewing. Her hand went to her throat. A small cough escaped her lips. Gabrielle's head snapped up instantly, that maternal instinct that every mother has when something's wrong with her child. "Maya? Baby, what's wrong?" Maya coughed again, harder this time. Her eyes were starting to water. "Mommy, my throat feels funny." Gabrielle's blood ran cold. She grabbed the granola bar wrapper from Maya's hand and her eyes went straight to the ingredients list. And there, in the small print that you had to squint to read, were the words that made her heart stop. "Contains peanuts, tree nuts." No. No, no, no. In the chaos of the morning, rushing to make their flight, Gabrielle had grabbed the wrong box of granola bars from the pantry. They looked almost identical, same brand, same packaging, different varieties. She always bought two kinds, one that was safe for Maya and one for herself that happened to contain nuts. She kept them separate, always checked labels, always made sure Maya only had the safe ones. But this morning, in the rush of packing, the early wake-up call, the excitement of the trip, she'd grabbed from the wrong box. She'd put the nut-containing granola bars in Maya's backpack. And now her daughter had just eaten peanuts. Maya, spit it out, baby. Spit it out right now. Gabrielle's voice was urgent but controlled, trying not to scare her daughter even as panic was starting to claw at her chest. Maya spit the remaining food into a napkin, but she'd already swallowed at least one full bite. The allergens were already in her system, already triggering a reaction. The coughing intensified. Maya's small hand clutched at her throat, her eyes wide with fear. Mommy, I can't, it's hard to. Maya's breathing was becoming labored. Each breath was a struggle. Her face, which had been brown and beautiful just moments ago, was starting to change color, taking on a reddish hue as her body struggled to get oxygen. Baby, look at me. Look at Mommy. Gabrielle's hands were shaking, but her voice stayed steady because she needed Maya to stay calm. Panic would make the reaction worse. You're going to be okay. I'm right here. I've got you. But even as she spoke those reassuring words, Gabrielle was reaching for her purse with fumbling fingers, searching for the EpiPen she always carried. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This wasn't supposed to happen. Maya's allergies were supposed to be mild. They'd never had a reaction this severe before. A little Benadryl had always been enough. But looking at her daughter now, seeing the struggle to breathe, the fear in those wide eyes, the redness spreading across her face, Gabrielle knew this was different. This was serious. This was every parent's nightmare coming true at 35,000 feet in the air. Passengers in nearby seats were starting to notice. The businessman across the aisle looked up from his laptop. The couple in the row behind leaned forward with concern. Robert, the elderly physician, immediately stood up, his medical training kicking in even in retirement. Maya's breathing was getting worse. She was wheezing now, that high-pitched, struggling sound that meant her airways were constricting. Her small chest was heaving with the effort of each breath. Tears streamed down her face, not just from the physical reaction but from fear, the primal fear of not being able to breathe. Gabrielle's voice rose, no longer calm, no longer controlled, but urgent and desperate. I need water. Now. My daughter is having an allergic reaction. She looked up, searching for Rosa, searching for any flight attendant who could help. But the person who appeared wasn't Rosa. It was Christine Morrison. And when Christine saw what was happening, when she saw 8-year-old Maya Thompson gasping for air, clutching her throat, tears streaming down her face, her skin turning red as her body fought desperately for oxygen, do you know what Christine Morrison did? She folded her arms across her chest and said the words that would end her career, destroy her reputation, and quite possibly land her in prison. If you're as shocked as I am by what's unfolding on this flight, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. And I want to know, have you ever witnessed discrimination or racism on a flight? Share your experiences in the comments below, because Maya's fight for her life is just beginning, and Christine Morrison is about to learn that some choices have consequences you can't escape. Christine Morrison approached row 2 slowly, and if you were watching her face, you'd see something disturbing. Not concern, not urgency, but annoyance. Pure, undisguised annoyance that these passengers were causing a disruption in her cabin. Maya was gasping for air, her small chest heaving with each desperate attempt to breathe. Her face had gone from its beautiful brown tone to an alarming reddish hue, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clutched Peanut the elephant with one hand and her throat with the other. The wheezing sound coming from her constricted airways was audible to everyone nearby, that high-pitched, struggling noise that signals genuine respiratory distress. Gabrielle's voice cut through the cabin, urgent and desperate in a way that should have triggered every human instinct to help. Water. Please, my daughter is choking, she's having an allergic reaction. Christine stopped beside their row and looked down at Maya. Not with concern. Not with the immediate assessment of someone trained to handle in-flight medical emergencies. But with dismissiveness, with skepticism, with the cold calculation of someone who had already decided this wasn't a real problem. She looks fine to me, Christine said, her tone flat and disbelieving. Then her eyes moved from Maya to Gabrielle, and what she said next would echo through that aircraft, through the videos that passengers were already starting to record, through the news coverage that would follow, and through every legal deposition for months to come. You people always cause drama on flights. You people. Those two words contain centuries of racism, of prejudice, of othering, of dehumanization. Those 2 words revealed exactly who Christine Morrison was and what she believed. And she said them while an 8-year-old child struggled to breathe just inches away from her. Gabrielle's voice sharpened, the careful composure she'd maintained throughout the flight finally cracking under the weight of watching her daughter suffocate. "Excuse me? My daughter cannot breathe. Get me water right now." But instead of responding to the emergency, instead of following the protocols she'd been trained on for 18 years, Christine Morrison crossed her arms across her chest in a posture of defiance and authority. "Don't raise your voice at me. I don't respond well to aggressive behavior." Aggressive behavior. A mother begging for help for her dying child was being characterized as aggressive. A black woman asking for the basic human decency of water during a medical emergency was being painted as the problem, as the threat, as the one behaving inappropriately. Maya's condition was deteriorating. The wheezing was getting worse. Each breath was a battle she was losing. Her small fingers dug into Peanut the elephant, that stuffed animal that had comforted her through bad dreams and doctor's visits and first days of school. Her eyes, wide with terror, searched for her mother's face, looking for reassurance that everything would be okay, even as her body told her something was very, very wrong. Around them, other passengers were beginning to react. This wasn't subtle discrimination that could be ignored or rationalized away. This was a medical emergency playing out in real time, and a flight attendant was refusing to help. The businessman who'd been working on his laptop stood up, his face contorted with disbelief. A woman across the aisle gasped, her hand going to her mouth. The couple behind them leaned forward, trying to see what was happening, their expressions shifting from curiosity to horror. And Robert Patterson, that 72-year-old retired physician, stood up with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years in medicine and knew exactly what he was looking at. His voice boomed through the first-class cabin, cutting through the ambient noise of the aircraft engines. "For God's sake, get the child water." Christine turned to him and somehow, impossibly, she managed to produce a smile. Not a genuine smile, but that fake, practiced customer service smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Sir, please remain seated. I have everything under control." Everything under control. An 8-year-old was literally suffocating, and Christine Morrison claimed she had everything under control. Robert's face flushed red with anger. "Are you insane? That child is in respiratory distress. She needs immediate." But Christine had already turned back to Gabrielle, and what she said next would become the most damning statement in the entire incident. "If your daughter has a medical condition, maybe you shouldn't have brought her on this flight. First class is for passengers who don't cause problems." Let that sink in for a moment. A child having an allergic reaction was characterized as causing problems. A mother's desperate attempt to save her daughter's life was framed as an inconvenience. And Christine Morrison, in her infinite bigotry and cruelty, suggested that people with medical conditions, people like Maya, didn't belong in first class. The subtext was clear and disgusting. First class was for healthy white people, not for black children with allergies who might need help, who might cause a scene, who might disrupt the carefully maintained hierarchy that Christine believed in. Gabrielle was shaking. Her hands trembled as she looked at her daughter, whose breathing was becoming more labored with each passing second. The medical training she'd gotten when Maya was first diagnosed with peanut allergies kicked in through her panic. She knew what she had to do. Her hands dove into her purse, fumbling past her phone, her wallet, her tablet, searching for the one thing that could save her daughter's life. The EpiPen. She always carried it, always had it accessible, always knew exactly where it was. But in this moment of terror, with her daughter gasping and Christine Morrison standing there with her arms crossed refusing to help, even finding the EpiPen felt like it took an eternity. Her fingers closed around the familiar cylindrical shape. She pulled it out, her hands still shaking, and looked at Maya. "Baby, this is going to help you. It's going to feel like a pinch, but it's going to help you breathe. I need you to trust Mommy, okay?" Maya, struggling to get air, could barely nod. Tears continued to stream down her face. She was terrified, confused about why she couldn't breathe, why her throat felt like it was closing, why the nice flight attendant who'd given her the coloring book wasn't there but this mean one was standing with her arms crossed looking annoyed. Gabrielle positioned the EpiPen against Maya's thigh, right through her purple dress. Her medical training ran through her mind. Press firmly, hold for several seconds, make sure it injects properly. Her hands were shaking so badly she worried she might drop it, might do it wrong, might fail her daughter in this crucial moment. But a mother's love is steadier than fear. Gabrielle pressed the EpiPen firmly against Maya's thigh and triggered it. The auto-injector clicked, a sound that was both mechanical and somehow reassuring, the sound of medicine entering Maya's system, of help finally arriving. Maya cried out at the sharp pain, but Gabrielle held the EpiPen in place, counting the seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, making sure the full dose was administered. Then she pulled it away and immediately pulled Maya into her arms, holding her daughter close, feeling the small body shake with fear and the struggle to breathe. That's when Rosa appeared, rushing from the galley with bottles of water clutched in both hands. She'd been in the back preparing meals when the commotion started, and the moment she understood what was happening, she'd grabbed water and run. Christine's glare followed her, but Rosa didn't care anymore. A child's life was more important than her senior colleague's prejudice or her own job security. Here, I have water," Rosa said, her voice urgent but gentle as she twisted off the cap and handed the bottle to Gabrielle. "Thank you," Gabrielle managed, her voice thick with emotion. She held the bottle to Maya's lips. "Baby, small sips. Slow, small sips. Breathe through your nose if you can. In and out. That's it. You're doing so good. Mommy's got you. I've got you." Maya managed a small sip, then another. The epinephrine was starting to work, opening her airways slightly, allowing precious oxygen back into her lungs. The redness in her face began to ease just a little. Her breathing, while still labored, wasn't quite as desperate as it had been 30 seconds ago. But she was still wheezing, still struggling, still in danger. And Christine Morrison, instead of offering help or calling for the captain or doing anything useful, stood there with her arms still crossed and said something so callous, so ignorant, so infuriating that several passengers gasped out loud. "You can't just inject things on an aircraft. That's probably against regulations." Gabrielle's head snapped up. Her eyes, which had been focused entirely on Maya, now fixed on Christine with a look that could have melted steel. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but filled with a rage that was barely contained. "Call the captain. Tell him we need to land immediately." Christine actually scoffed. It was a small sound, dismissive and derisive, the sound of someone who couldn't believe the audacity of what was being asked of her. "We're not making an emergency landing because your daughter ate something she shouldn't have. That would delay everyone." Everyone. Christine was more concerned about the convenience of the other passengers, or more accurately, about the inconvenience to herself and the airline's schedule, than she was about an 8-year-old child's life. Robert Patterson had heard enough. He stepped into the aisle, his full height and the authority of his 72 years and 4 decades of medical practice radiating from him. "I'm a retired physician. This child needs immediate medical attention. Land this plane." His words triggered a reaction from other passengers who had been watching in stunned silence. They began to stand up, to voice their agreement, to add their demands to his. "Land the plane. That child needs a hospital. What is wrong with you? Help her." The first-class cabin, which had been a space of quiet luxury just 10 minutes earlier, had transformed into a scene of chaos and moral outrage. Passengers who'd been strangers to each other were now united in their horror at what they were witnessing. Christine's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or anger was unclear. She tried to reassert her authority, raising her voice over the growing chorus of passenger demands. "Everyone needs to calm down. I'm the senior crew member here." Gabrielle stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and somehow more intimidating than if she jumped up quickly. She kept one arm around Maya, holding her daughter close, but her full attention was now on Christine Morrison. When she spoke, her voice had dropped to something cold and precise, each word falling like ice. "What's your name?" Christine, caught off guard by the question and the tone, answered automatically. "Christine Morrison. Not that it's any of your business." Gabrielle's eyes never left Christine's face. "Christine Morrison. I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember the choice you made today." There was something in Gabrielle's voice, something in her bearing, that finally made Christine uncertain. For the first time since this interaction began, a flicker of doubt crossed Christine's face. But Gabrielle wasn't done. She pulled out her phone with her free hand, keeping Maya tucked against her side. She scrolled through her contacts with the practiced ease of someone who made dozens of important calls every day, someone whose phone contained direct lines to people that most humans would never speak to in their entire lives. She selected a contact labeled James, Executive Assistant, and pressed call. The phone rang twice before a professional male voice answered. "James, it's Gabrielle Thompson." Her voice was calm now, terrifyingly calm, the calm of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had the power to do it. "I need you to connect me to the CEO of Skyward Airlines right now." "Yes, right now. I don't care if he's in a meeting." Christine's expression shifted. The certainty, the superiority, the smug authority she'd been radiating began to crack around the edges. CEO? This woman was calling the CEO of the airline? Who was she? But Gabrielle was continuing, her instructions precise and methodical. And while you're at it, get me the FAA's Passenger Rights Division and our legal team. Patch them all into one call. Passengers around them had their phones out now, recording. Multiple cameras were pointed at this confrontation, capturing every word, every expression, every moment of what was unfolding. The video footage that would emerge from this flight would trend on every social media platform within hours. Christine tried to regain some sense of control. You can't make phone calls during. Gabrielle cut her off with a look that could freeze fire. I can do whatever I want. Trust me on that. And there was something in those 7 words, in the absolute certainty with which they were delivered, that made everyone in the first-class cabin understand that Gabrielle Thompson was not making empty threats. She wasn't posturing. She wasn't bluffing. Christine Morrison, in her prejudice and her cruelty, had made the catastrophic mistake of assuming that the black woman in seat 2A was powerless. That she could be dismissed, disrespected, denied help, and there would be no consequences. That racism was safe. That discriminating against a mother and her dying child would result in nothing more than perhaps a complaint letter that would be filed away and forgotten. But Gabrielle Thompson wasn't powerless. And Christine Morrison was about to discover exactly how much power one determined mother with a billion-dollar company and connections in the highest levels of government and industry could wield when someone threatened her child's life. James's voice came through the phone, professional and efficient. Miss Thompson, I'm connecting you now. Mr. Patterson's assistant is pulling him out of his board meeting. Patterson. David Patterson. The CEO of Skyward Airlines. A man who ran a multi-billion-dollar company with thousands of employees and millions of passengers annually. And he was being pulled out of a board meeting because Gabrielle Thompson demanded to speak to him. Christine's face had gone pale. She was beginning to understand that she'd made a terrible mistake, but she didn't yet grasp the full magnitude of what was about to happen to her career, her reputation, and her life. Robert, the retired physician, was still standing in the aisle, monitoring Maya's condition with professional concern. The epinephrine is helping, but she needs to be on the ground. She needs a hospital. This child could still go into anaphylactic shock, and up here at this altitude there's only so much we can do. Another passenger, a woman in her 40s who'd been sitting quietly until now, stood up and addressed Christine directly. I'm a nurse. Dr. Patterson is right. This is a medical emergency. Why haven't you informed the captain? Christine opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was trapped, caught between her prejudice and her growing realization that this situation had spiraled completely beyond her control. Rosa stood nearby, holding more bottles of water, her face stricken with worry for Maya, but also worry about what this meant, about what had been allowed to happen on this flight, about the culture that had enabled Christine Morrison to believe she could treat passengers this way. Other flight attendants had emerged from the galley and the back of the cabin, drawn by the commotion. They stood uncertain, looking between Christine and the passengers, clearly unsure what to do. Christine was their senior crew member, the one they were supposed to defer to, but what she was doing was so obviously wrong that even her colleagues were beginning to question her authority. Gabrielle held Maya close, feeling her daughter's breathing gradually improve as the epinephrine worked its magic. But improve wasn't the same as recovered. Maya was still in danger. She still needed medical care. She still needed to be on the ground. And on the phone, James was speaking again. Miss Thompson, I have Mr. Patterson on the line now. Gabrielle's voice, when she spoke into the phone, was clear and carrying, meant not just for David Patterson but for every person in that first-class cabin, for every person recording this moment, for the historical record of what happened when racism met maternal fury and corporate power. Mr. Patterson, this is Gabrielle Thompson. I am currently on your flight 2847 from New York to Atlanta. I am sitting in first class with my 8-year-old daughter who just had a severe allergic reaction to peanuts. She couldn't breathe. She was choking. And your flight attendant, Christine Morrison, refused to give her water and told me, Gabrielle's voice hardened even further, that you people always cause drama on flights and that maybe I shouldn't have brought my daughter on this aircraft if she has a medical condition. The silence on the phone was absolute. Then David Patterson's voice came through, and he sounded genuinely horrified. She said what? Your flight attendant stood there with her arms crossed while my daughter gasped for air, Gabrielle continued. Multiple passengers demanded she help, including a retired physician who is still standing in the aisle. She refused. She told me we were causing problems. And then, after I administered an EpiPen to save my daughter's life, she told me I couldn't inject things on an aircraft. We need an emergency landing. My daughter needs a hospital. I'm connecting with the flight crew immediately, Patterson said, his voice tight with urgency and what sounded like genuine rage. Miss Thompson, please stay on the line. I'm contacting the captain directly. Christine Morrison stood frozen in the aisle, watching her entire world collapse around her. The passengers recording her. The looks of disgust and disbelief on their faces. The phone call that was happening right in front of her, exposing everything she'd done to the CEO of the entire airline. She tried one more time to regain control. Everyone needs to return to their seats. I'll handle this situation. But Robert, that kind-faced retired physician, turned to her with more contempt than he'd shown another human being in years. You've handled nothing. You've endangered a child's life. And if I have anything to say about it, you'll never work in aviation again. The other passengers murmured their agreement, some of them more vocal. Disgusting. I can't believe what I just witnessed. That poor baby. And through it all, Gabrielle held Maya, whispering reassurances, monitoring her breathing, being the mother that Maya needed even as she simultaneously destroyed the career of the woman who had nearly killed her daughter through deliberate negligence and racism. On the phone, David Patterson's voice returned. Miss Thompson, I've contacted the captain. The aircraft is being diverted to the nearest suitable airport. Emergency medical services will be standing by when you land. I cannot express how appalled I am. Please tell me how your daughter is doing. The epinephrine is helping, but she's still in distress, Gabrielle said, her voice finally showing the strain of what she'd been through. She's breathing better than she was, but she needs a hospital. You'll be on the ground in 15 minutes, Patterson assured her. And Miss Thompson, I will be meeting you at the hospital personally. We need to discuss this situation in detail. What happened on this flight is inexcusable. Yes, Gabrielle said, her eyes fixed on Christine Morrison's pale, shocked face. Yes, we will definitely be discussing this. The captain's voice came over the intercom, interrupting the chaos of the first-class cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a medical emergency on board, and we will be making an immediate landing at Philadelphia International Airport. Emergency services will be meeting the aircraft. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing. The plane began its descent, and Christine Morrison, her face now completely drained of color, finally seemed to understand the full weight of what she'd done. She'd let her racism, her prejudice, her need to maintain some imagined hierarchy, override her basic humanity. She'd refused to help a choking child. She'd dismissed a mother's desperate pleas. She'd valued her own authority and comfort over a little girl's life. And now, as the plane descended toward Philadelphia, as emergency vehicles prepared to meet them on the tarmac, as the CEO of Skyward Airlines promised to meet them at the hospital, as dozens of passengers sat with their phones full of video evidence of her cruelty, Christine Morrison finally understood that choices have consequences. She'd chosen hatred over humanity. She'd chosen racism over compassion. She'd chosen her prejudice over a child's life. Anne Gabrielle Thompson, that quiet, dignified woman in seat 2A, was going to make sure Christine Morrison spent the rest of her life understanding exactly what those choices had cost her. If this story has moved you, if you're as outraged as those passengers were, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because the reckoning that's about to unfold when this plane lands will restore your faith that justice sometimes really does prevail. And I have to ask you, have you ever had to stand up against discrimination or injustice? Share your story in the comments, because Maya's fight isn't over yet, and what happens when they land is going to change everything for Christine Morrison, for Skyward Airlines, and for every person who's ever been treated as less than human simply because of the color of their skin. The captain's voice finally came over the intercom, cutting through the chaos of the first-class cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a medical emergency on board. We will be making an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and remain seated. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing. Rosa had done it. While Christine had been standing in the aisle watching her authority crumble, while passengers had been recording and demanding action, Rosa had slipped away to the cockpit and informed the pilots of the true severity of what was happening. She told them about Maya's allergic reaction, about Christine's refusal to help, about the child who was struggling to breathe while a flight attendant stood by with her arms crossed. The plane began its descent and you could feel it, that shift in altitude, that change in engine tone, that sensation in your ears that tells you the aircraft is dropping from cruising altitude faster than normal. This wasn't the gradual, gentle descent of a routine landing. This was an emergency descent, The kind where pilots are calculating the fastest, safest route to get an aircraft on the ground. Christine Morrison's face, which had already been pale with the dawning realization of what she'd done, went even whiter. The blood drained from her features as the full gravity of the situation hit her like a physical blow. An emergency landing. The plane was being diverted because of what had happened in her cabin, under her watch because of her choices. She stood frozen in the aisle for a moment, her mind clearly racing. Around her, passengers were securing their belongings, fastening their seatbelts, following the emergency procedures they'd been taught during the safety demonstration that most people ignore. But many of them were also watching her, their eyes filled with disgust, anger, judgment. Some were still recording, making sure every moment of this was documented. Gabrielle held Maya wrapped tightly in her arms, one hand on her daughter's back, feeling each breath, monitoring the rhythm and depth. The epinephrine had done its job. Maya's airways had opened enough that she could breathe, though each breath was still labored, still accompanied by that slight wheeze that told Gabrielle her daughter wasn't out of danger yet. "Mommy, I'm scared," Maya whispered against her mother's chest, her small voice muffled by the fabric of Gabrielle's blazer. Gabrielle's heart broke and hardened simultaneously. She pressed her lips to the top of Maya's head, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter's hair, the coconut oil and shea butter they used every morning, that smell that meant safety and love and home. "I know, sweetie. But you're going to be fine. Mommy's got you. The plane is landing and there are going to be doctors waiting for us who are going to make sure you're completely okay." Maya nodded against her chest, trusting completely, the way children trust their parents to keep them safe from the monsters in the world. But Gabrielle's next words carried a weight that Maya was too young to fully understand. "And Mommy's going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." Those words weren't just a promise to her daughter. They were a vow, a declaration of war against the system that had allowed Christine Morrison to treat them this way, against the culture that had made Christine feel safe in her prejudice, against every airline policy and training program and corporate structure that had failed to prevent this moment. Christine finally moved, retreating toward the galley where the other flight attendants had gathered. They watched her approach with expressions that ranged from concern to confusion to barely concealed anger. They'd heard everything. They'd seen what she'd done. And now their flight was being diverted, which meant delays, investigations, incident reports, potential liability for the airline and for all of them by association. Christine's voice was low and urgent as she spoke to them, but several passengers were close enough to hear fragments of what she was saying. "It's not what it looks like. She was being aggressive. I was trying to maintain order. These people always exaggerate." Even now, even as the plane descended toward an emergency landing, Christine was trying to construct a narrative that would save her, trying to reframe her cruelty as appropriate protocol, her racism as reasonable caution. But the other flight attendants weren't nodding along. One of them, a young man who looked barely out of his 20s, actually stepped back from Christine, physically distancing himself from what she represented. Another shook her head, her expression one of disbelief. Rosa stood slightly apart from the group, her eyes finding Gabrielle across the cabin. She mouthed two words, "I'm sorry." Gabrielle nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology for what it was, one decent person trying to apologize for the actions of another. Rosa had helped. Rosa had brought water when Christine refused. Rosa had informed the captain when Christine wouldn't. Rosa had done what a human being with basic compassion and decency would do. And Gabrielle would remember that. The descent continued, the plane dropping through clouds, the ground rising up to meet them. Philadelphia International Airport was coming into view through the windows. Runways, terminals, emergency vehicles already positioning themselves for the incoming aircraft. Robert, the retired physician, remained standing despite the captain's instructions to be seated, his medical training overriding protocol. He was watching Maya carefully, assessing her breathing, her color, her level of consciousness. "How's she doing?" he asked Gabrielle quietly. "Better than she was," Gabrielle replied, her voice tight with stress. "The epinephrine helped. But she needs a hospital." "She'll get one," Robert assured her. "And that woman," he gestured toward Christine, his face hardening, "that woman should face criminal charges for child endangerment." He wasn't wrong. What Christine had done went beyond poor customer service or even discrimination. She had deliberately withheld assistance from a child in a medical emergency. She had refused water to a choking child. She had prioritized her own prejudice and authority over an 8-year-old's ability to breathe. In many jurisdictions, that met the legal definition of child endangerment, reckless endangerment, and possibly even attempted manslaughter. The plane touched down, the wheels hitting the tarmac with a thump that was rougher than usual, the kind of landing that comes when pilots are more concerned with speed than smoothness. The aircraft decelerated rapidly, the engines reversing, the brakes engaging hard enough that passengers lurched forward against their seatbelts. As soon as the plane came to a stop, before it had even reached the gate, the main cabin door was opened. Paramedics boarded immediately, rushing down the aisle with their equipment. Medical bags, portable oxygen, a stretcher just in case. 2 paramedics reached Gabrielle and Maya within seconds. "Hi there, sweetheart," one of them said gently to Maya. "My name's Marcus. How are you feeling?" Maya, still clinging to her mother, looked up at the paramedic with wide, frightened eyes. "My throat hurts. And I'm tired." "I bet you are," Marcus said kindly. He looked at Gabrielle. "Mom, can you tell me what happened?" Gabrielle gave a concise medical history that impressed even the paramedics. When the reaction started, what Maya had eaten, when the epinephrine was administered, how Maya's breathing had responded, current symptoms. She was calm, clinical, giving them exactly the information they needed to assess her daughter's condition. The second paramedic, a woman named Keisha, was already checking Maya's vital signs: pulse, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, respiratory rate. "Her O2 is at 94%, which isn't terrible considering what she's been through. But we definitely want to get her to the hospital for observation and possibly a second dose of epinephrine if needed. Can I go with her?" Gabrielle asked, though her tone made it clear this wasn't really a question. She was going with her daughter, end of discussion. "Of course," Marcus assured her. "We wouldn't separate you." As the paramedics prepared to move Maya, Gabrielle stood, still holding her daughter. But before leaving the aircraft, she turned and looked directly at Christine Morrison, who was standing in the galley trying to make herself invisible. Their eyes met across the cabin, and in that moment, Christine saw something in Gabrielle's expression that made her blood run cold. Not anger, anger would have been easier to face. What Gabrielle projected was cold, calculated determination. The look of someone who had made a decision and possessed the resources and power to see it through to the end. Gabrielle's voice carried through the first-class cabin, clear and unmistakable. "Don't go anywhere. We're not done." Those 5 words hung in the air like a verdict, a promise, a threat. Christine's face somehow went even paler. She knew what was coming. Maybe not the specifics, maybe not the full extent of what Gabrielle Thompson could do, but she knew that her life as she'd known it was over. The paramedics helped Gabrielle and Maya off the aircraft, and behind them, a different kind of arrival was taking place. Airport police were boarding the plane, 2 officers moving with purpose down the aisle toward the first-class cabin. "We need to speak with the flight crew," one officer announced. "We've received reports of a serious incident involving a medical emergency and possible negligence." Passengers immediately began volunteering information, eager to tell their stories, to make sure the truth was heard. "Officer, I recorded the whole thing," one woman called out, holding up her phone. "That flight attendant refused to help a choking child." "I'm a physician," Robert said, stepping forward with the authority his profession commanded. "I witnessed the entire incident." The flight attendant, Christine Morrison, deliberately withheld assistance from a child in respiratory distress due to an allergic reaction. "I got it on video too," another passenger added. "Multiple angles." She told the mother, "I don't serve your kind," while the little girl was gasping for air. The officers began taking statements, and with each account, with each video that was shown to them, their expressions grew more serious. This wasn't a case of miscommunication or a passenger complaint about service. This was a potential criminal matter. Christine tried to defend herself, her voice shaking but still attempting to project authority. "Officers, I was just following protocol. That woman was being aggressive and difficult. She was raising her voice, causing a disturbance. I was trying to maintain order in the cabin." "That's a lie," Robert interrupted, his voice cutting through Christine's excuses with surgical precision. "You refused to help a choking child. I witnessed the entire thing. I am a retired physician with 40 years of experience, and I'm telling you that child was in genuine respiratory distress, and this woman," he pointed at Christine with unconcealed contempt, "refused to provide even basic assistance like water." Multiple passengers echoed his account, their voices overlapping in their eagerness to ensure justice was served. She was horrible to them from the moment they boarded. She served everyone except them. The little girl was turning red, couldn't breathe, and she just stood there with her arms crossed. She said, "You people always cause drama on flights." I heard it clearly. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his face flushed with anger. He was a man in his late 50s with gray at his temples and the bearing of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. When he'd been informed of the medical emergency, he'd immediately diverted the flight. But it wasn't until Rosa had come to the cockpit and told him the full story, about Christine's refusal to help, about her racist comments, about the severity of what had transpired, that he'd understood the complete picture. He strode directly to Christine, and his voice when he spoke was controlled but filled with barely suppressed fury. "Why wasn't I informed immediately when a passenger went into medical distress?" Christine stammered. I had the situation under control." "Under control?" The captain's voice rose. "A child nearly died. You call that under control? A child went into anaphylactic shock at 35,000 feet, and you didn't inform the cockpit? You refused to provide assistance? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Christine had no answer. Or rather, she had no answer that wouldn't further incriminate her. The truth was that she'd let her prejudice override her training, her professional obligations, and her basic humanity. And now she was facing the consequences. The police officers took control of the situation. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us to the airport security office for questioning. Do not leave this airport. We'll be conducting a full investigation." As Christine was led away, her face a mask of shock and fear, the passengers watched with a satisfaction that came from seeing justice begin to unfold. But for Gabrielle Thompson, this was just the beginning. At Pennsylvania Hospital, just minutes from the airport, Maya was being wheeled into an emergency room bay. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her with practiced efficiency, connecting monitors, checking vitals, administering additional medication to ensure her allergic reaction was completely controlled. Gabrielle stood beside the bed, holding Maya's hand, refusing to move despite the medical staff working around her. One nurse tried to gently suggest she might want to wait in the hallway, and Gabrielle's response was polite but absolute. "I'm not leaving my daughter." The nurse, seeing the steel in Gabrielle's eyes, wisely didn't push the issue. Meanwhile, in a corporate office tower in downtown Atlanta, David Patterson, CEO of Skyward Airlines, was in the middle of a quarterly board meeting when his executive assistant burst into the conference room. Something she would never do unless it was genuinely an emergency. "Sir, you have an emergency call." "It's Gabrielle Thompson." The room went silent. Several board members knew that name. Gabrielle Thompson. Thompson Aerospace Technologies. One of the most successful defense contractors in the country. A woman with connections in the Department of Defense, in Congress, in corporate boardrooms across America. Patterson's face went white. "Thompson?" "As in Thompson Aerospace." His assistant nodded, her expression grave. "She says it's urgent. She's calling from an ambulance." Patterson stood immediately, his mind racing through possibilities. Thompson Aerospace had contracts with Skyward Airlines for specialized aircraft components. But why would Gabrielle Thompson be calling him from an ambulance? What had happened? He excused himself from the board meeting and practically ran to his office. His assistant had already transferred the call to his direct line. He picked up the phone and his first words reflected genuine concern. "Miss Thompson, what can I do for you? Are you all right?" Gabrielle's voice came through the line, and it was calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than if she'd been screaming. It was the calm of someone who had moved past emotion into pure, calculated action. "Mr. Patterson, I'm calling from an ambulance with my 8-year-old daughter who nearly died on your airline because your flight attendant refused to give her water while she was choking." Patterson felt his stomach drop. What? I don't understand. What happened? Who was the flight attendant?" "Christine Morrison," Gabrielle replied, her voice still maintaining that terrifying calm. "Flight 2847 from New York to Atlanta. My daughter had an allergic reaction to peanuts. She couldn't breathe. She was gasping for air, turning red, choking. And your employee looked at her and refused to help. I have approximately 40 witnesses and multiple videos. Would you like to know what else your employee said to me, Mr. Patterson?" Patterson's hand was trembling as he held the phone. "Please tell me." "Your employee told me, and I quote, 'I don't serve your kind. My 8-year-old daughter was suffocating, and your flight attendant refused to provide water because of the color of our skin. My daughter is allergic to peanuts, she had a severe reaction at 35,000 feet, and your employee decided that her prejudice was more important than a child's life.'" The silence on the line lasted several long seconds. Patterson felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. In his 15 years as CEO, he'd dealt with many crises: mechanical failures, labor disputes, financial challenges, customer complaints. But this? A flight attendant refusing to help a choking child because of racism? This was a nightmare of a magnitude he'd never faced. Miss Thompson, I am. Patterson struggled to find words adequate to the situation and failed. I am horrified. I am appalled. I cannot. There are no words for how unacceptable this is. Please tell me, how is your daughter? She's alive because I had an EpiPen and knew how to use it, Gabrielle said, her voice hardening. She's alive because other passengers demanded your employee help, because a retired physician was on board and advocated for her. She's alive despite your flight attendant, not because of her. We're at the hospital now. The doctors say she'll be fine, but she could have died, Mr. Patterson. My daughter could have died because your employee valued her racism over basic human decency. Patterson's mind was already moving, calculating damage control, but also, and this was genuine, consumed with appropriate horror at what had happened. What do you need, Miss Thompson? What can I do? What I need, Gabrielle said, her words precise and deliberate, is for you to meet me at this hospital. Bring your head of HR and your legal team. We're going to have a very long conversation about your airline's culture, your training protocols, your hiring practices, and your future. Because right now, Mr. Patterson, I'm trying to decide whether Thompson Aerospace continues to do business with Skyward Airlines. I'm trying to decide whether I recommend to the 3 corporate boards I sit on that they continue their travel contracts with your company. Those contracts, combined, represent hundreds of millions of dollars annually. And I'm trying to decide whether I make this a private matter that we resolve quietly, or whether I make Skyward Airlines a very public example of what happens when corporate culture allows racism to flourish. Patterson felt sweat forming on his brow despite the climate-controlled office. I'll be there within the hour. We'll do whatever is necessary to make this right. Good, Gabrielle said. Because if you think I'm going to let this go, if you think you can offer me some vouchers and an apology and make this disappear, you fundamentally misunderstand who you're dealing with. My daughter almost died. And someone is going to answer for that. She hung up. Patterson stood in his office for a moment, the phone still in his hand, his mind reeling. Then he moved into action. He called his executive assistant. Get me legal, HR, and our head of flight operations. We're flying to Philadelphia immediately. Charter a plane if necessary. And find out everything we can about this incident. Passenger manifests, crew roster, any complaints filed against this flight attendant in the past, everything. Within minutes, his team was assembled. Within the hour, they were in the air, flying to Philadelphia to meet with Gabrielle Thompson, to face the consequences of what Christine Morrison had done. Back at the hospital, Maya was stable. The doctors had determined that the initial dose of epinephrine, combined with additional antihistamines and monitoring, had been sufficient. Her airways were clear, her oxygen levels were normal, her vital signs were good. She was going to be fine. She sat in a hospital bed, wearing a pediatric gown covered in cartoon characters, eating a popsicle that one of the nurses had brought her. Purple grape, her favorite. Peanut the elephant sat propped on the bed beside her, also wearing a small hospital bracelet that a kind nurse had made, because Maya had insisted that if she had to wear one, Peanut needed one too. Gabrielle sat in a chair pulled close to the bed, still wearing her cream blazer that was now wrinkled and had a small stain from where Maya had pressed her tear-stained face against it. She held Maya's free hand, her thumb rubbing gentle circles on her daughter's small palm. A doctor came in, a pediatric emergency medicine specialist named Dr. Sarah Chin, who'd been overseeing Maya's care. Miss Thompson, your daughter is doing remarkably well. The quick administration of the epinephrine was crucial. You saved her life with your fast action. Gabrielle nodded, but her expression was tight. I should never have had to. There should have been help available. Water should have been provided immediately when I asked for it. Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. I've been briefed on what happened. I'm a mandated reporter, and I'll be filing a report with Child Protective Services about the negligence your daughter experienced. Not against you, she clarified quickly. Against the airline employee who refused to help. Good, Gabrielle said. File every report you're required to file. I want a paper trail of what happened. I want documentation. Dr. Chin nodded and left them alone. Maya, working on her popsicle with the intensity of someone who'd been through a traumatic experience and was now focusing on something simple and good, looked up at her mother. Mommy, why was that lady so mean to us? Gabrielle paused, choosing her words carefully. This was one of those parenting moments that she'd known would come eventually but had hoped to delay for a few more years. How do you explain racism to an 8-year-old? How do you tell your child that some people will hate her for something she can't control and shouldn't have to? Some people, Gabrielle began slowly, Haven't learned that everyone deserves kindness and respect, no matter what they look like. That lady, she has something wrong in her heart and her mind. She was taught to think that people who look like us are less important than people who look like her. And she let that ugly thinking make her do something very, very wrong. Maya considered this her young mind processing. But we're not less important. No, baby. We're not. We're exactly as important as everyone else. Every person on this planet deserves to be treated with kindness and respect. Then why don't some people know that? Because, Gabrielle said, pulling her daughter close, because hate is something people learn. And it's something that other people have to unteach them. Which is what I'm about to do. Maya looked up at her mother with those wide, trusting eyes. Because you're going to teach them? Gabrielle smiled, and it was a smile that held both love for her daughter and steel for what was coming. Something like that, baby. A nurse entered the room, her expression apologetic for interrupting. Miss Thompson? There are several people here to see you. They say it's urgent. Something about Skyward Airlines? Gabrielle's smile shifted, becoming harder, more predatory. Tell them I'll be right there. And tell them to wait in a conference room. I'm not discussing this in a hallway. She turned to Maya. Baby, I need to go talk to some people about what happened on the plane. You're safe here with the nurses, okay? I won't be long. Maya nodded, secure in her mother's love and protection even after the trauma of the day. Okay, Mommy. Are you going to fix things? Yes, Gabrielle said, kissing her daughter's forehead. Yes, I am. The hospital had provided a conference room for the meeting, a neutral space with a long table, chairs, and nothing else. Gabrielle walked in still wearing her wrinkled travel clothes, but somehow she commanded the room more effectively than if she'd been wearing a power suit and fresh makeup. David Patterson stood immediately when she entered. He was flanked by his head of HR, a severe-looking woman named Margaret Hayes, his chief legal counsel, a man named Richard Torres, and his VP of Flight Operations, James Murphy. They all looked uncomfortable, worried, like students called to the principal's office. Miss Thompson, Patterson began, his voice filled with what seemed like genuine concern. First, before anything else, how is your daughter? Gabrielle's eyes were cold as she regarded him. She'll survive. No thanks to your employee. Patterson nodded, his expression pained. I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what happened. What Christine Morrison did was inexcusable, unconscionable, and completely contrary to everything our airline stands for. Is it? Gabrielle asked, her voice sharp. Because from where I was sitting, it seemed very much in line with your airline's culture. Or is this the first time one of your flight attendants has discriminated against passengers? Margaret from HR shifted uncomfortably. Miss Thompson, we take all complaints of discrimination seriously. Do you? Gabrielle interrupted. Because I'd be very interested to see Christine Morrison's file. I'd be interested to know if there have been other complaints against her. Other incidents where she treated passengers differently based on their race. The legal counsel, Richard, spoke carefully. We're conducting a full investigation. Save it, Gabrielle said, her voice cutting. Let me tell you what's already happened while you were flying here. Christine Morrison has been terminated. I know this because David here texted me from the plane. Airport police have taken her into custody for questioning. They're considering charges of child endangerment, reckless endangerment, and potentially criminal negligence. Multiple passengers have already posted their videos online, and this story is currently trending on Twitter under the hashtag #SkywardRacism. Your company's stock has dropped 3% in the last hour. And I'm just getting started. The room was silent. Now, Gabrielle continued, let me tell you what's going to happen next. Because contrary to what you might be hoping, this doesn't end with firing one employee and offering me a settlement agreement with an NDA attached. Patterson looked physically ill, but he nodded. Miss Thompson, will do whatever you think is appropriate. Good. Because here's what's going to happen. Gabrielle counted off on her fingers. First, Thompson Aerospace has a $100 million contract with Skyward Airlines for specialized aircraft components. That contract is now under review. Whether we continue that business relationship depends entirely on what happens in the next few weeks. The room went completely silent. $100 million was significant even for a major airline. Second, Gabrielle continued, I sit on the boards of 3 major corporations, Titanium Financial, Mercer Tech, and Broadfield Manufacturing. Combined, those 3 companies have corporate travel contracts with your airline totaling approximately $200 million annually. I will be recommending to those boards at our next meetings that they review those partnerships and consider alternative carriers. Patterson's face had gone pale. $300 million in contracts suddenly at risk. Third, and this is non-negotiable, I want a complete overhaul of your diversity training programs. I want transparent, public reporting on discrimination complaints filed against your employees and how they're resolved. I want a passenger bill of rights displayed prominently in every cabin on every flight, outlining exactly what passengers can expect in terms of service and treatment, and what recourse they have if that treatment is denied. Margaret was taking notes frantically, nodding. Fourth, I want Skyward Airlines to establish a fund, $1 million, dedicated to supporting organizations that fight discrimination in travel and transportation. And I want quarterly reports on how that money is being distributed and what impact it's having. Richard, the legal counsel, started to speak. Ms. Thompson, that's a significant commitment. Gabrielle's eyes flashed, and her voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. That's nothing compared to what I could do. My daughter almost died at 35,000 feet because a bigot decided she wasn't worth a cup of water. My 8-year-old child gasped for air while your employee stood there with her arms crossed spouting racist rhetoric. So you're going to do this, all of this, or I'm going to make Skyward Airlines a case study in corporate negligence and systemic racism. I will testify before Congress if necessary. I will take out full-page ads in every major newspaper detailing what happened. I will use every connection I have in media, in government, in business, to make sure that what happened to my daughter becomes a national conversation about racism in the airline industry. Do I make myself clear? The room was silent except for the sound of Margaret's pen scratching on her notepad. Patterson, to his credit, didn't try to negotiate or minimize. He simply nodded. We agree to all of your terms. Every single one. We'll have formal agreements drawn up within 48 hours. And Ms. Thompson, for what it's worth, and I know it probably isn't worth much right now, I am truly, genuinely horrified by what happened to you and your daughter. This doesn't represent who we are or who we want to be. Then make sure it never represents who you are again, Gabrielle said. Because I'll be watching. And trust me when I say that I have the resources and the determination to make sure you follow through on every single promise you just made. Patterson stood, extending his hand. Gabrielle looked at it for a moment before shaking it. A handshake that sealed an agreement but conveyed no forgiveness, no absolution. This was business. This was justice. This was a mother ensuring that what happened to her daughter would lead to change. As Patterson and his team left, Gabrielle stood alone in the conference room for a moment. The adrenaline that had been carrying her through the day was beginning to fade, and underneath it was exhaustion, trauma, anger, and the lingering fear of how close she'd come to losing her daughter. But she didn't have time to process those emotions. She had more work to do. Over the following days and weeks, the story exploded across media platforms. The videos from the flight went viral, accumulating millions of views. News outlets picked up the story. Racist flight attendant refuses water to choking black child became a headline on major networks. Talk shows discussed it. Social media erupted with outrage and support. Christine Morrison's name became synonymous with racism and cruelty. She was fired, arrested, and charged with multiple counts of child endangerment and reckless endangerment. She faced civil lawsuits not just from Gabrielle but from several other passengers who'd witnessed the incident and suffered emotional distress. Her mugshot circulated online, accompanied by stories from other passengers who came forward with their own experiences of her discriminatory behavior over the years. It turned out that Christine Morrison had multiple complaints in her file, complaints that had been noted but never seriously addressed. Passengers who'd felt discriminated against, who'd been treated with coldness and contempt while white passengers received warmth and excellent service. The complaints had been there all along, but the airline system for addressing them had been inadequate, performative rather than substantive. Rosa, the flight attendant who had helped Maya and informed the captain, became a different kind of viral figure. Passengers praised her humanity, her courage in standing up to her senior colleague, her quick thinking in getting help. Skyward Airlines, recognizing both the PR opportunity and the genuine value of her character, promoted her and featured her in their new diversity training programs as an example of how employees should act. 3 weeks after the incident, Gabrielle received a thick envelope from Skyward Airlines. Inside was a detailed letter outlining all the policy changes that had been implemented. A complete overhaul of diversity training, now mandatory quarterly for all employees, with particular focus on implicit bias and recognizing discrimination. A new passenger bill of rights, displayed in every cabin, outlining service standards and complaint procedures. A transparent online portal where passengers could file discrimination complaints and track their resolution. The establishment of the Skyward Social Justice Fund, with $1 million in initial funding, dedicated to supporting organizations fighting discrimination in travel. The termination and retraining of multiple managers who had failed to adequately address previous discrimination complaints. A new vice president position dedicated solely to diversity, equity, and inclusion, reporting directly to the CEO. Gabrielle read through every page, verifying that every promise had been kept. Then she filed the letter carefully, because she would be checking on these commitments regularly. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of holding Skyward Airlines accountable. She also received messages, dozens, then hundreds of them, from other passengers who had experienced discrimination on flights and were now speaking out, empowered by Maya's story. From parents of children with allergies who were horrified by what had happened and grateful that someone was forcing change. From civil rights organizations thanking her for using her platform and resources to fight for justice. One evening, as Gabrielle and Maya sat together in their home in New York, safe and comfortable and surrounded by the life Gabrielle had built through determination and brilliance, Maya looked up from her homework. "Mommy? Did we change things?" Gabrielle thought about the policy changes, the national conversation, the people who'd come forward with their own stories, the cultural shift happening within Skyward Airlines and rippling outward to other carriers who were examining their own practices. We started to change things. And we're going to keep going." Maya nodded, satisfied with that answer, and returned to her math problems. Peanut the elephant sat on the desk beside her, a silent witness to everything they'd been through and everything they'd accomplished. In the face of discrimination and injustice, one mother had turned a moment of horror into a catalyst for change. Christine Morrison learned that day that hatred has consequences. She lost her career, faced criminal charges, and became a national symbol of the racism that still infects institutions and individuals. She would spend years paying for the choice she made to value her prejudice over a child's life. But more importantly, Maya Thompson learned something crucial that day. She learned that her voice matters, that her life matters, that she is exactly as valuable and deserving as any other human being. She learned that her mother will always fight for what's right, no matter who stands in the way. She learned that injustice doesn't have to be accepted, that power used for good can create change, that speaking up matters. Sometimes it takes grounding an entire flight to make people understand that every child deserves basic human dignity, regardless of the color of their skin. Sometimes it takes a mother's love combined with a billionaire's power to force institutions to confront their failures and commit to real change. Sometimes it takes tragedy narrowly averted to spark conversations that should have been happening all along. This is what happens when you underestimate a mother's love. This is what happens when you mistake quiet dignity for powerlessness. This is what happens when you let racism override your humanity and discover too late that the person you're discriminating against has the resources, the connections, and the determination to ensure your actions have real, lasting consequences. Christine Morrison thought she could refuse water to a choking black child without repercussions. She was wrong. And because she was wrong, because Gabrielle Thompson refused to let this injustice disappear quietly, airlines across the country are now examining their policies, their training, their culture. Passengers with stories of discrimination are speaking up, empowered by the knowledge that their voices matter. Change is happening, slowly but steadily, because one mother decided that her daughter's near-death experience would mean something, would lead to something, would prevent other children from facing the same cruelty. What would you have done in Gabrielle's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it inspired you to believe that justice is possible even when it seems impossible, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about courage, justice, and standing up against discrimination. Because stories like Maya's matter. The fight for equality and dignity matters. And together, we can make sure that no child ever again has to gasp for air while someone with the power to help stands by with folded arms and hatred in their heart. The story of Maya Thompson and that flight didn't end when the news cycle moved on to the next headline. It continued in ways both large and small, creating ripples that spread far beyond a single incident on Flight 2847. 6 months after the incident, Gabrielle was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on transportation and civil rights. She sat in that hearing room in Washington, D.C., poised and powerful, and told Maya's story to lawmakers who had the authority to create federal protections for airline passengers. Her testimony was calm, factual, devastating. She detailed not just what happened to her daughter but the systemic issues that allowed it to happen. The inadequate complaint systems, the lack of transparency, the way discrimination complaints were noted but rarely addressed, the culture that protected employees like Christine Morrison until their prejudice nearly killed a child. The footage of her testimony went viral just like the original flight videos had. One particular moment resonated across social media, when a senator tried to suggest that this was an isolated incident, an anomaly that didn't reflect broader problems. Gabrielle leaned forward and said something that became a rallying cry. "Senator, with all due respect, when my daughter couldn't breathe when she was gasping for air, that wasn't an anomaly to her. That was her reality. And it's the reality for thousands of passengers who experience discrimination every single day but don't have the resources or platform to fight back. We can't dismiss systemic problems by calling them isolated incidents. Every isolated incident happens within a system that enables it." That clip was played on news shows, shared millions of times, quoted in think pieces and academic papers. Gabrielle Thompson became not just a mother who had protected her child, but a voice for institutional change, for accountability, for the recognition that discrimination in any form is unacceptable and must be met with real consequences. Maya, for her part, processed the trauma in the way children do, with resilience that amazes adults, but also with questions that required honest answers. She had nightmares for months about not being able to breathe, about feeling scared and helpless. Gabrielle found her a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma, and slowly, carefully, Maya healed. But she also grew. She became more aware of the world around her, more conscious of how people treated others, more willing to speak up when she saw something wrong. In school, when she witnessed a classmate being excluded because of how they looked or spoke, Maya intervened. "Everyone deserves kindness," she would say, echoing her mother's words. "Everyone matters." Her teachers noticed the change, the way this bright 8-year-old, now 9, now 10, carried herself with a maturity and moral clarity that was unusual for her age. They didn't know the full story at first, but they recognized that Maya Thompson was someone special, someone who had learned lessons about justice and dignity that many adults never learn. Christine Morrison's life, meanwhile, had completely imploded. The criminal charges resulted in convictions: child endangerment and reckless endangerment. She served 6 months in prison and was sentenced to 2 years of probation. But the legal consequences were almost secondary to the social ones. Her name was permanently associated with racism and cruelty. Potential employers Googled her and found page after page of articles, videos, commentary about what she'd done. She couldn't work in aviation again, she'd been blacklisted by every major carrier. She couldn't work in hospitality or customer service. Who would hire someone whose face was synonymous with discrimination? She tried to rebuild her life in anonymity, moving to a different state, changing her appearance, hoping time would let her fade into obscurity. But the internet has a long memory, and periodically her story would resurface. A new viral post about racism, a documentary about discrimination in travel, an anniversary article about the incident, and there would be Christine Morrison's face, a cautionary tale about what happens when prejudice overrides humanity. Some people might have felt sympathy for her, might have argued that she'd paid her debt to society and deserved a second chance. But most people remembered an 8-year-old child gasping for air, and they remembered Christine Morrison standing with her arms crossed, refusing to help. Some actions are so morally repugnant that society doesn't forgive them, no matter how much time passes. Robert Patterson, the retired physician who had advocated for Maya on the flight, became a vocal supporter of Gabrielle's efforts to reform airline policies. He wrote op-eds about what he'd witnessed, gave interviews, attended press conferences. At 72 years old, he'd thought his career in medicine was behind him, that his most impactful days were in the past. But witnessing what happened to Maya had awakened something in him. A renewed sense of purpose, a determination to use his remaining years fighting for justice. He and Gabrielle became unlikely allies, an elderly white physician and a young black tech billionaire, united by their experience on that flight and their commitment to ensuring it never happened again. They co-authored articles about implicit bias in emergency medical situations, about how racism can literally kill people when it prevents them from receiving timely care. Rosa, the flight attendant who had helped, found her life changed as well, though in positive ways. Her promotion came with opportunities to help reshape Skyward's training programs. She worked with diversity consultants to develop scenarios that would prepare flight attendants to recognize and confront discrimination, not just dramatic incidents like what happened to Maya, but the everyday microaggressions that passengers of color faced constantly. She thought often about that day, about the moment when she'd had to choose between obeying her senior colleague and doing what was right. She'd chosen correctly, but it hadn't been easy, and she recognized that many people in her position might have chosen differently. That's why the training mattered, to create a culture where doing the right thing was not just permitted but expected, where standing up to discrimination was valued more than maintaining hierarchy. The Skyward Social Justice Fund that Gabrielle had demanded became a model for other corporations. That initial $1 million grew as the airline added matching contributions from employees and executives who wanted to support the mission. The fund supported organizations working on racial justice, disability rights, LGBTQ advocacy, recognizing that discrimination takes many forms and all of them must be confronted. Grant recipients included nonprofits providing legal assistance to passengers who experienced discrimination, research institutions studying implicit bias in transportation, advocacy groups pushing for stronger federal protections, educational programs teaching children about diversity and inclusion. Every quarter, Skyward published detailed reports on how the money was being used, maintaining the transparency Gabrielle had demanded. Other airlines, watching Skyward's transformation and recognizing the reputational risk of not addressing discrimination proactively, began implementing similar changes. Some did so grudgingly, driven by fear of becoming the next viral story. Others did so more authentically, recognizing that their own systems and cultures needed examination and reform. The result was industry-wide change that might never have happened without Maya's story forcing a national conversation. Passenger bills of rights became standard. Discrimination complaint systems became more transparent and robust. Training programs evolved to address not just blatant racism but subtle biases that affected service quality. Flight attendants and other airline employees were empowered to speak up when they witnessed discrimination, with protections ensuring they wouldn't face retaliation for doing so. Was it perfect? No. Did discrimination disappear from air travel? Of course not. Changing culture is slow work, and prejudice is deeply rooted in ways that policies alone can't solve. But things were better than they'd been, more people were aware, more systems were in place to address problems when they occurred. Maya's near-death experience had sparked change that protected thousands of other passengers, and that meant something. Gabrielle expanded her advocacy beyond airlines. She used her platform and resources to fight discrimination in other industries: hospitality, healthcare, education, housing. She funded organizations doing civil rights work, invested in businesses owned by people of color, mentored young entrepreneurs who faced the same doubts and barriers she'd overcome. But she also made sure to protect Maya's childhood, to ensure her daughter wasn't defined by what had happened to her. They still flew to visit Grandma in Atlanta, though never on Skyward Airlines. Some wounds don't heal that way. Maya still colored pictures and played with Peanut the elephant and did normal kid things. She went to birthday parties and took dance classes and complained about homework. Yet the experience had marked her, shaped her understanding of the world and her place in it. She knew, in a way most children don't, that the world wasn't always fair or kind. She knew that people might treat her differently because of her skin color. She knew that injustice existed and that fighting it required courage, persistence, and power. But she also knew something equally important, that her mother would always protect her, that there were good people like Rosa and Dr. Patterson who would stand up for what's right, that change was possible when people refused to accept the unacceptable. Those lessons would serve her well as she grew older and faced her own battles against discrimination and injustice. Years later, when Maya was in high school, she wrote a college application essay about that day on the plane. Not because it defined her, but because it had taught her something crucial about using privilege and power for good, about turning trauma into action, about the responsibility that comes with having resources and platforms that others don't. She wrote about her mother's response, not just the anger, which would have been justified, but the strategic way Gabrielle had channeled that anger into systemic change. She wrote about learning that justice isn't just about punishing individual bad actors, but about transforming the systems that enable those actors. She wrote about wanting to continue that work in her own way, to use whatever power and platform she developed to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. The essay got her into every school she applied to. But more importantly, it crystallized for her what kind of person she wanted to become. Someone like her mother, someone who turned pain into purpose, someone who refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. And Christine Morrison? Years later, working a minimum wage job under a different name in a different state, she would sometimes see news coverage about Gabrielle Thompson. A new business venture, a philanthropic initiative, a speech at some prestigious event. And she would remember that day on the plane, the choice she'd made, the moment when her prejudice had cost her everything. Sometimes late at night, she would wonder what her life might have been if she'd just given that little girl a cup of water. If she'd responded with compassion instead of contempt, with humanity instead of hatred. How different everything might have been, not just for her but for Maya, for all the passengers who'd witnessed the incident, for the industry that had been forced to confront its failures. But she'd made her choice, and choices have consequences. That's the lesson she learned too late, the lesson that cost her career, her reputation, her freedom, and any chance at the life she'd once had. Racism isn't just morally wrong, it destroys the person who embraces it, corrodes their humanity, and ultimately leaves them with nothing but regret and the weight of consequences they can never escape. The story of Flight 2847 became a case study in business schools, examining corporate crisis response and the cost of inadequate discrimination policies. It became a teaching tool in medical schools, illustrating how bias can interfere with emergency care. It became a reference point in civil rights discussions, an example of how individual incidents of discrimination reflect and reveal systemic problems. But beyond all the policy changes and institutional reforms, beyond the testimony in the headlines and the viral videos, the story was really about something simpler and more profound. A mother's love for her child, and the lengths a mother will go to protect that child and ensure no other child suffers the same harm. Gabrielle Thompson could have accepted a settlement, signed an NDA, taken some compensation and moved on with her life. Many people in her position would have. But she recognized that she had resources and power that most victims of discrimination don't have, and she chose to use those resources not just for her own family but for everyone who flies, everyone who might face similar treatment, everyone who deserves basic human dignity regardless of their race or background. That choice, to fight not just for justice but for systemic change, made all the difference. It transformed a personal tragedy into a catalyst for broader reform. It gave voice to countless passengers who'd experienced discrimination but felt powerless to address it. It forced an entire industry to confront uncomfortable truths about its culture and practices. And it taught Maya Thompson, at just 8 years old, one of the most important lessons a person can learn: that we have a responsibility to use whatever power we have to make the world more just, more fair, more kind. That injustice unchallenged becomes injustice normalized. That speaking up matters, that fighting back matters, that refusing to accept the unacceptable can change not just your own life but countless other lives as well. So when people ask what would happen if you refused water to a choking child, if you let your prejudice override your humanity, if you mistook quiet dignity for powerlessness, the answer is this: you might find yourself face to face with someone who has the power to ensure you never forget your choice, who will use every resource at their disposal to make sure your cruelty leads to change, who will transform your hatred into a lesson the world won't forget. Christine Morrison thought she could deny help to a dying child without consequences. She was catastrophically wrong. And because she was wrong, because Gabrielle Thompson refused to let this injustice fade into obscurity, the world is a little bit better, a little bit fairer, a little bit more just. That's what happens when you underestimate a mother's love and a billionaire's power. That's what happens when you choose racism over humanity. And that's why Maya Thompson's story will be remembered long after all the people involved have passed from this world. As a reminder that every child deserves basic human dignity, that discrimination must be met with real consequences, and that change is possible when people with power choose to use it for good. What would you have done in Gabrielle's position? Would you have fought for change or accepted a quiet settlement? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story inspired you, if it reminded you that justice is possible even in the face of systemic discrimination, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that like button, share this story, and join us in believing that one person with courage and determination really can change the world, or at least make it a little bit better for the children who come after.